Sometimes the hardest part of losing someone isn't saying goodbye. It's figuring out how to live without them. For 61-year-old Cora Fields, that lesson came when she bought a rusted boat in a dry field outside Millbrook. Her neighbors thought she'd lost her mind. The old fishing vessel hadn't seen water in decades. Its hull was eaten through with rust holes. Its windows were cracked and clouded. For $3,000, she'd purchased what most folks called an eyesore. But Cora saw something different. She saw the last connection to dreams she'd shared with her late husband Harold. With basic tools and Harrod's forgotten journals, she began transforming the decrepit vessel. What started as one woman's quiet grief became something extraordinary. What could possibly emerge from such rust and ruin that would leave her skeptical? Neighbors speechless? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Cora Fields first laid eyes on the boat, dewdrops clung to the wild grass that had grown up around its weathered hull like nature's attempt to reclaim what man had abandoned. She stood at the edge of Farmer Mackenzie's back 40, her sensible walking shoes already damp from the early September frost, clutching Harold's worn leather travel journal against her chest like a shield. 61 years of careful living had taught her to weigh decisions carefully, to consider consequences, to choose the safe path. As head librarian at Millbrook Elementary for 37 years, she'd built a reputation for quiet competence and thoughtful guidance. Children would seek her out not just for help finding books, but for the gentle wisdom she offered with equal measure to their academic struggles and playground heartaches. Parents trusted her. Colleagues respected her. The school board had honored her with a retirement dinner just 3 months ago, complete with a gold watch and speeches about her steadfast dedication to young minds. But standing there in morning light, looking at 32 feet of rust and ruin, Cora felt anything but steadfast. She felt untethered, adrift in a life that suddenly seemed too quiet, too empty, too predictable. Harold had been gone 8 months now. 8 months since the heart attack took him while he was reading the Sunday paper, his coffee still warm on the kitchen table, his reading glasses perched on his nose as if he'd simply dozed off. 8 months of well-meaning casseroles from neighbors, of learning to sleep alone in their queen-sized bed, of making coffee for one instead of two. The house on Maple Street felt cavernous now. 40 years of shared life echoed in every room. Harold's favorite armchair still bore the impression of his body. His gardening boots still sat by the back door. His half of the closet still held clothes she couldn't bring herself to donate. Friends urged her to get back out there, to join the book club or take up watercolor painting at the community center. But Cora wasn't ready for the bright chatter of widow support groups or the determined cheerfulness of hobby classes. What she was ready for, apparently, was buying a boat. The idea had struck her 3 weeks ago while sorting through Harold's belongings, a task she'd been avoiding with increasing creativity. She'd finally worked up the courage to tackle his desk drawers, expecting to find the usual debris of a man's life: old receipts, expired warranties, pens that no longer worked. Instead, she discovered a treasure trove of dreams deferred. Travel brochures for places they'd never visited, camping catalogs for equipment they'd never bought, boating magazines dating back 15 years, their pages worn soft from repeated reading. And buried beneath it all, his travel journal, page after page of careful handwriting documenting adventures they'd planned but never taken. "When we retire," Harold had written in his methodical script, "we'll buy a boat. Nothing fancy. Just big enough for the two of us. We'll take it to Lake Superior in the summers, maybe down the Mississippi in the fall. We'll wake up to the sound of water lapping against the hull instead of traffic on Elm Street." They talked about it, of course, over morning coffee and evening walks. They'd spun elaborate fantasies about their someday adventures. The boat they'd buy, the places they'd go, the freedom they'd find on open water. But someday had remained stubbornly theoretical, postponed by Harold's job at the insurance office, by Cora's responsibilities at the school, by the comfortable routine that had shaped their days for 4 decades. Now someday would never come. Not for Harold, anyway. The boat listing had appeared in the classified section of the Millbrook Gazette like a sign. 32-foot fishing vessel, needs work, landlocked, $3,000 oboe. The description was hardly inspiring, but something in those sparse words had stirred something in Cora's chest, a flutter of possibility she hadn't felt in months. She'd called the number before she could lose her nerve. Farmer Mackenzie had been straightforward about the boat's condition. Been sitting there nigh on 12 years, he'd told her over the phone. Bought it from a fella who thought he'd fix her up, but life got in the way. You know how it is. She's not seaworthy, mind you. Hull's got some holes. But the bones are good, real good. Standing before it now, Cora wondered if the farmer's definition of good bones matched her own. The vessel listed slightly to port, its white paint long since faded to the color of old bone and peeling away in great sheets. Rust stains ran down the hull like tears, and several windows were spider-webbed with cracks. The cabin door hung, askew on corroded hinges. Yet something about its solitary presence in the field stirred her imagination. Surrounded by autumn gold grass and framed by distant mountains, the boat looked like it was waiting not for water, but for purpose. "You sure about this, Mrs. Fields?" Farmer Mackenzie had emerged from his truck, his weathered hands shoved deep in his coat pockets. At 73, he'd known Cora since she was a young bride fresh from teacher's college. "It's a mighty big project for someone who's—" He paused, clearly searching for diplomatic words. "Someone who's what?" Cora asked, though she could fill in the blanks herself. "Someone who's alone. Someone who's never held a power tool more complex than a screwdriver. Someone who should be content with bridge club and volunteer work at the church. Well, someone starting fresh," he finished kindly. Cora walked closer to the boat, running her hand along the rough texture of its hull. The metal was cold but solid beneath her palm. "How much land comes with it?" "Quarter acre, give or take. Enough for a garden if you've a mind to. County says it's gotta stay put. Can't be moved without proper permits and such. But there's power lines nearby if you wanted to run electric out here." She could see it then, suddenly and completely, as if Harold were whispering the vision in her ear, not the boat as it was, but as it could be. Windows cleared and gleaming, the whole scraped clean and painted fresh. A small garden plot where the weeds now grew wild. Solar panels, maybe, and a wind chime on the tiny deck. A place apart from the suffocating sympathy of her neighbors. Apart from the empty rooms that echoed with Harold's absence. A place to build something new from something broken. "I'll take it," she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. Mackenzie studied her face for a long moment. "You got someone to help you with the work? It's not a one-person job, fixing up something this size." Cora thought of her brother-in-law Tom, who'd already offered to help her sell Harold's tools. Of her neighbor Margaret, who'd been dropping hints about hiring a handyman to clean out the garage. Of all the people who thought they knew what was best for her. "I'll figure it out," she said. The paperwork was surprisingly simple. Mackenzie had owned the land and boat free and clear, and he seemed almost relieved to pass the responsibility to someone else. As Cora wrote the check $3,000 from the savings account she and Harold had built for their retirement adventures, she felt something shift inside her chest. Not happiness exactly, but possibility, purpose. On the drive back to town, she stopped at Henderson's Hardware, where old Pete Henderson greeted her with the same patient smile he'd worn for 30 years. "Afternoon, Mrs. Fields. What can I do for you today?" "I need some basic tools," she said, "and maybe some advice about boat restoration." Pete's eyebrows climbed toward his receding hairline. "Boat restoration?" Word would spread. She knew. By evening, half of Millbrook would know that the quiet librarian had bought herself a rusty boat in Mackenzie's field. By tomorrow, the other half would have theories about her mental state. Let them talk, she thought. Let them wonder. For the first time in 8 months, she had something to do besides grieve. That evening, she sat in Harold's chair now, she supposed, with his travel journal open in her lap. The pages were filled with his careful plans. Routes mapped out in colored pencil, lists of supplies they'd need, sketches of the boat they dreamed of owning. One page was different from the others, though. Tucked near the back, it held a single paragraph written in Harold's fading ink. "Cora worries too much about what other people think," he'd written. "She's got dreams as big as mine, but she keeps them tucked away like good china, saving them for special occasions that never quite arrive. If something happens to me first, I hope she finally let herself be bold. She deserves adventures, even if she has to take them alone." Cora closed the journal and pressed it against her heart, feeling the weight of Harold's faith in her. Tomorrow she would drive back to the boat. Tomorrow she would begin. Tonight she would plan. Asterisk. The first morning Cora arrived at the boat with Harold's toolbox. The September air carried the promise of autumn's arrival. She'd risen before dawn, unable to sleep past 5:30, a habit formed during 40 years of school mornings that retirement hadn't yet broken. After 2 cups of coffee and a piece of toast she barely tasted, she'd loaded Harold's red metal toolbox into the back of her Honda Civic, along with a thermos, a folding chair, and a determination that felt both thrilling and terrifying. Harold's toolbox was a monument to good intentions. He'd bought it 15 years ago when they'd first talked seriously about retirement projects. The boat they'd buy, the workshop he'd build in the garage, the household repairs he'd finally have time to tackle. The tools inside were still bright with newness, their edges sharp and unmarred by use. A complete socket set nested in perfect order. Screwdrivers of every size lay in their designated slots. A level still in its protective case. A measuring tape that had never measured anything more ambitious than picture frames. Looking at the pristine condition of everything, Cora felt a familiar pang of regret. Harold had been the dreamer between them, the one who researched projects and made lists and planned for someday. She'd been the practical one, pointing out obstacles and reasons to wait. Now, someday was here, and she was facing it alone with tools that had waited as patiently as their owner for a chance to be useful. The boat looked different in the morning light, less romantic, more daunting. What had seemed like a noble project in yesterday's golden hour now revealed itself as an enormous undertaking. The hull was larger than she'd remembered, stretching over 30 feet from bow to stern. The damage was more extensive, too. Rust holes she hadn't noticed. A section near the waterline where the metal had corroded completely through. Deck planking that sagged ominously under her cautious footsteps. But Cora had committed herself, and 4 decades of facing down unruly third graders had taught her the value of following through on decisions, especially when they seemed overwhelming. She set up her folding chair in the shade of the boat's starboard side and opened Harold's journal to study his sketches. His drawings were precise and detailed, showing not just a boat they dreamed of buying, but modifications they might make. A small galley with efficient storage, bench seating that could convert to sleeping berths, built-in bookshelves. He's known his wife well enough to plan for her need to be surrounded by stories. One page made her breath catch. It was dated just 6 months before Harold's death, and the handwriting was looser than his usual careful script. "Saw a boat today in Mackenzie's field," he'd written. "Told Cora it was an eyesore, but something about it got me thinking. Good bones. The right size for 2 people who don't need much except each other and a place to watch the sunrise. Maybe when we retire, he'd seen this boat. He'd stood where she was standing now and imagined their future in its empty hull. The realization hit her like a physical blow, doubling her over in the folding chair as grief crashed through her careful composure. Harold had been planning this. Not just dreaming, but actually planning. He'd seen their boat and known it for what it could become. All those years of gentle postponement, of practical objections, of waiting for the right time, and he'd found it. Found it and lost it in the space between heartbeats on a Sunday morning in January. When the worst of the crying subsided, Cora felt something she hadn't experienced since the funeral. Harold's presence. Not the crushing weight of his absence. That had defined the past 8 months, but the warm certainty that he was somehow near, somehow approving of her presence here among the rust and weeds. She wiped her eyes with a tissue from her purse and stood up. Harold's journal still clutched in her hand. Time to begin. The boat's door was her first challenge. The frame had warped over the years, and rust had welded the hinges into stubborn immobility. Cora selected what she hoped was the right screwdriver from Harold's collection and began working. At the screws. They resisted at first, their heads worn smooth by weather and corrosion. Her hands, soft from years of handling books rather than tools, began to blister within minutes. But gradually, triumphantly, the screws began to turn. One by one they came free, clattering to the ground like small victories. When the door finally swung open on protesting hinges, Cora felt a surge of accomplishment that surprised her. With its intensity, the interior was a cavern of shadows and possibilities. Weak morning light filtered through grimy windows, illuminating a space that was larger than her living room, but infinitely more full of potential. The previous owner had stripped most of the fixtures, leaving behind only the bare bones of what had once been a functional vessel. Exposed ribs curved along the hull like the skeleton of some great creature. The floor was littered with debris leaves blown in through broken windows, fragments of fiberglass, the desiccated remains of what might once have been a bird's nest. Cora stepped inside, her footsteps echoing strangely in the confined space. Despite the decay and neglect, she could feel the boat's inherent dignity. The craftsmanship was evident in the smooth curves of the hull, in the solid feel of the deck beneath her feet, in the way the space seemed to embrace rather than confine her. She spent the rest of the morning simply clearing debris, filling garbage bags with the accumulated detritus of abandonment. With each bag removed, the boat's true nature became clearer. The bones were indeed good, as Mackenzie had promised. The hull was sound except for the rust holes she'd already identified. The windows, while dirty and cracked, were still in there. Frames. The electrical system was gone, but the mounting points remained, clearly marked for future restoration. By noon, her back ached, and her hands were definitely blistered. But the boat's interior was clean enough to reveal its possibilities. Cora sat in her folding chair with a peanut butter sandwich and Harold's journal, sketching her own ideas in the margins of his careful plans. A reading nook where the forward berth would go. Open shelving instead of closed cabinets to create a sense of spaciousness. Windows cleaned and maybe painted with frost patterns to provide privacy while letting in light. She was so absorbed in her planning that she didn't notice the pickup truck pulling up beside her, Honda, until a car door slammed. Margaret Whitman, our next-door neighbor for 15 years, picked her way across the uneven ground with the determined gait of a woman on a mission. "Cora Fields, what in heaven's name are you doing out here?" Margaret's voice carried the sharp edge of concern, mixed with disapproval, that Cora had grown accustomed to over the past months. At 68, Margaret had appointed herself the neighborhood's unofficial guardian of propriety and good sense. Her silver hair was perfectly styled despite the early hour, and her sensible cardigan was coordinated with her sensible shoes in a way that spoke of a life organized around other people's expectations. "I'm working on my boat," Cora said, gesturing toward the hull with what she hoped was casual confidence. "Your boat. Margaret's tone suggested she was testing the words for signs of mental instability. Cora, honey, this isn't a boat. This is a rusty old hulk that someone abandoned in a field. It's my rusty old hulk now. Margaret climbed the few steps onto the boat's small deck, her disapproval deepening as she took in the scope of the project. This is about Harold, isn't it? You're trying to do something he would have done. And sweetheart, I understand the impulse, but this is dangerous. You could get hurt out here. You could fall through that deck or cut yourself on all this rusty metal. Cora felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever someone spoke to her in that particular tone. The careful, patronizing voice reserved for children and the recently bereaved. I'm being careful. Are you? Look at your hands. Cora glanced down at her blistered palms, then back at Margaret's concerned face. They'll heal. That's not the point. The point is that this is too much for one person. Especially one person who's never done this kind of work before. Margaret's voice softened. I know you miss him. We all do. But Harold wouldn't want you out here risking your safety for some impossible project. How do you know what Harold would want? The sharpness in her own voice surprised Cora. She'd never spoken to Margaret, to anyone, with such directness. But something about standing in Harold's dreamboat, surrounded by the evidence of her morning's work, made her less willing to defer to other people's opinions about her choices. Margaret blinked, clearly taken aback. I just meant, you meant. Well, I know. Cora's voice was gentler now, but no less firm. But this isn't about grief, Margaret. It's about purpose. For the first time in 8 months, I have something to do that matters. Something that's mine. After Margaret left still shaking her head but clearly recognizing a lost cause when she saw one, Cora returned to work with renewed determination. By evening, she'd managed to remove 2 more bags of debris and had started a list of supplies she'd need for the real work to begin driving home as the sun set behind the mountains. She felt the satisfying ache of muscles used in unfamiliar ways. Her hands throbbed, her back protested, and her sensible shoes were scuffed beyond repair. She'd never felt better in her life. Asterisk. 3 weeks into the project, Cora had established a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. She arrived at the boat each morning by 7:30, after the dew had lifted but before the day grew too warm for sustained physical labor. Her Honda's trunk now carried a permanent collection of supplies. Work gloves to protect her healing hands, a thermos that stayed filled with coffee, and a growing assortment of tools she'd learned to use through trial and considerable error. The boat's interior had been transformed from a debris-filled shell into something resembling a workspace. She'd swept and scrubbed until the original color of the deck emerged, a warm honey-colored wood that had weathered to silver in places, but remained structurally sound. The windows, while still cracked, were clean enough now to let in cheerful streams of morning light that danced across the curved walls as the day progressed. But it was Harold's record player that truly brought the space to life. She'd found it. In the basement, buried beneath Christmas decorations and boxes of Harold's college textbooks. The turntable was a 1970s Technics model, solid and reliable, the kind of equipment built to last decades rather than seasons. Harold had treasured it, spending Sunday afternoons in his basement workshop listening to Miles Davis or Ella Fitzgerald while he puttered with household repairs that never quite materialized into major projects. Cora had carried it to the boat. On a Tuesday morning, along with a milk crate filled with albums they'd collected over 40 years of marriage. Setting it up had required running an extension cord from the nearest power line, a minor electrical project that would have horrified her 6 months ago, but now felt like a reasonable challenge to tackle. The first song she played was The Way. You Look Tonight, the same Sinatra recording that had been their first dance at their wedding. As the familiar melody filled the boat's interior, something shifted in the space around her. The empty hull no longer felt abandoned or forlorn. It felt expectant, alive with possibility and memory. The music carried beyond the boat's walls, drifting across Mackenzie's field like an invitation. Cora didn't notice her first visitor until a shadow fell across the doorway, blocking the late morning sun. "Excuse me, ma'am?" Cora looked up from the section of hull she'd been examining for rust damage. A young man stood in the doorway, perhaps 30 years old, with the kind of careful posture that spoke of recent military service. His clothes were clean but worn, and there was something in his expression, a mix of curiosity and caution, that reminded her of students who'd been hurt before and weren't sure if it was safe to trust again. "I'm sorry to bother you," he continued. "I was working in the field over yonder and heard the music. Thought maybe someone was in trouble." "No trouble," Cora said, wiping her hands on her work pants. "Just restoration. Would you like some coffee? I always make too much." The young man hesitated, clearly torn between curiosity and the instinct to keep moving. "I don't want to interrupt your work." "You're not interrupting anything that can't wait." "I'm Cora Fields. Danny Reeves." He stepped cautiously into the boat's interior, his eyes adjusting to the filtered light. "This is ... wow. I mean, from outside it just looks like an old boat. But in here ... He gestured at the clean lines of the hull, the way the morning light played across the curved surfaces. "It's got real potential. That's what I keep telling myself." Cora poured coffee from her thermos into the extra cup she'd started bringing, though she couldn't have said why. "Are you new to the area?" "Sort of. Been staying with my uncle out on Miller Road while I figure out what's next." Danny accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping his hands around the warm cup. "I'm between things right now." There was a story there, Cora could tell. 40 years of working with children had taught her to recognize the particular brand of lost that came from major life transitions. But she'd also learned the value of patience, of letting people share what they were ready to share. "What kind of work were you doing in the field?" she asked instead, helping Mackenzie with his late harvest. "Temporary work, but it pays fair, and I like being outdoors." Danny's gaze traveled around the boat's interior, taking in the record player, the neat stacks of supplies, the careful way Cora had organized her workspace. "This is really something. How long have you been working on it?" 3 weeks, though some days it feels like 3 years. Danny laughed, the sound unexpectedly warm in the enclosed space. "My grandfather restored an old Chris-craft when I was a kid. Took him 4 summers, but when he was done, it was the most beautiful thing you ever saw. Used to take me out on Lake Champlain every Sunday after church. What happened to it? He sold it when his arthritis got too bad to handle the maintenance. Always regretted that." Danny took a sip of coffee, his expression thoughtful. "This reminds me of those summers. Not just the boat, but the feeling of building something that matters." They talked for nearly an hour, their conversation meandering from boats to music to the changing colors of the autumn leaves. Danny had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before coming home to a civilian world that felt strangely foreign after the intense purpose of military life. He was taking classes at the community college, studying engineering with the eventual goal of becoming a contractor, but the transition was harder than he'd expected. "Everyone keeps asking what I want to do with my life," he said, staring into his coffee cup. "Like there's some perfect answer I'm supposed to have figured out by now. But honestly, I just want to build something again, something that lasts." When Sinatra gave way to Billie Holiday and Holiday to Duke Ellington, Danny made no move to leave. Instead, he asked thoughtful questions about Cora's restoration plans and offered observations about structural integrity that suggested a practical knowledge of construction. When she mentioned her concerns about the rust holes near the waterline, he crouched down to examine them with the focused attention of someone who understood the difference between cosmetic damage and serious structural problems. "These aren't As bad as they look, he said, running his fingers along the affected area. The corrosion is surface level mostly. You could patch these with some good marine-grade filler and a few hours of careful work. You know about boat repair? Some. Grandfather taught me the basics when I was helping with his restoration. I'm no expert, but I know the difference between fixable and hopeless. When Danny finally left, promising to stop by again if Cora didn't mind the company, the boat felt different somehow, less like a solitary retreat and more like a place where stories could be shared, where the past could inform the present without dominating it. That evening, Cora called Harold's sister Beth, who lived in Portland and worried constantly about Cora's adjustment to widowhood. "I met someone today," Cora said without preamble. "Oh." Beth's voice brightened with the hopeful tone of someone who'd been waiting 8 months for this conversation. "Tell me about him." "He's young enough to be my son, and he's helping me understand marine construction." There was a pause. "Marine construction? For the boat, Beth. The boat I'm restoring." "Oh, the boat." Beth's tone shifted from hopeful to carefully neutral. "How's that going?" "Better than I expected. I think Harold would be proud." "I'm sure he would, honey. I just worry about you taking on such a big project all by yourself." "I'm not by myself," Cora said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Not anymore." After she hung up, Cora sat in Harold's chair with a cup of tea and his travel journal open in her lap. On the page dated 3 months before his death, she found a passage she'd somehow missed before. "Music makes everything better," Harold had written. "When we get our boat, the first thing I'll do is set up a sound system. Good music makes any space feel like home, and Cora deserves a home that sounds like joy." Tomorrow, she decided, she'd ask Danny if he knew anything about marine electrical systems. The boat needed more than just music. It needed the kind of sound system that could fill the space with joy and carry that joy out into the world beyond its walls. Asterisk. The cast iron oven arrived on a Thursday morning in early October, delivered by 2 burly men who seemed genuinely puzzled by the request to carry it to the boat in Mackenzie's field. Cora had found it at an estate sale in the next county over a compact, wood-burning model that some long-ago homesteader had used to bake bread and roast Sunday dinners in a one-room cabin. "You sure about this, lady?" asked the older of the 2 delivery men as they maneuvered the heavy appliance through the boat's narrow doorway. "This thing weighs near 200 pounds, and it ain't coming back out easy." "I'm sure," Cora said, though privately she wondered if she'd lost her mind. Entirely. The oven had cost $800 money from the savings account she and Harold had earmarked for their retirement adventures. But standing in the boat's interior that morning, imagining the scent of fresh bread mingling with autumn air, and the sound of jazz drifting across the field, the purchase had felt not just reasonable but essential. Danny arrived just as the delivery men were leaving, his timing so perfect that Cora suspected he'd been watching for them from his work in Mackenzie's far field. Over the past 2 weeks, his daily visits had become as regular as sunrise, usually timed to coincide with Cora's mid-morning coffee break. "Now that's serious commitment," he said, surveying the oven with obvious admiration. "You planning to actually cook in here?" Asterisk. "I'm planning to bake bread," Cora said, running her hand along the oven's smooth black surface. "Harold always said the best boats felt like home, and home smelled like something good cooking." Asterisk. Danny nodded thoughtfully. "We'll need to install proper ventilation first. Can't have you smoking yourself out of your own boat." The casual "we" in his statement made Cora's chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. When had this become a collaborative effort? When had Danny appointed himself her partner in this impossible project? And why did the prospect fill her with relief rather than the independence-minded resistance she would have expected? Installing the oven's chimney pipe became their first major engineering challenge. The boat's original design hadn't contemplated wood-burning appliances, which meant cutting a hole through the cabin roof, a modification that felt both thrilling and terrifying in its permanence. "Measure twice, cut once," Danny said, echoing advice his grandfather had drilled into him during those long-ago summers on Lake Champlain. "And then measure again, because patching a roof is harder than getting it right the first time." They spent the better part of 3 days planning the installation. Consulting marine construction guides, Danny borrowed from the library and YouTube videos that made the process look deceptively simple. When they finally fired up Danny's reciprocating saw to cut through the roof, Cora felt the same mixture of terror and exhilaration she imagined skydivers experienced in the moment before jumping. But the hole was perfect, exactly the right size for the chimney pipe, positioned to avoid structural beams, sealed with marine caulk that would keep the autumn rains from turning her restoration project into an indoor swimming pool. The first loaves emerged from the oven on a Saturday afternoon, when the October air carried the crystal clarity that comes just before winter. Cora had chosen her grandmother's recipe for honey wheat bread, a forgiving formula that had fed 3 generations of her family and could accommodate the quirks of an unfamiliar oven. The scent that emerged from the boat's open windows was nothing short of magical. Rich and warm and unmistakably homey, it drifted across Mackenzie's field like an invitation written in the universal language of fresh-baked comfort food. The first to answer that invitation was Mrs. Chun from the farmhouse, a quarter-mile down the road. Cora had seen her occasionally, working in her enormous vegetable garden or hanging laundry on lines that stretched between 2 ancient oak trees. But they'd never spoken beyond polite waves across the distance. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion," Mrs. Chun said, appearing in the boat's doorway with the hesitant manner of someone following an irresistible impulse. "I was working in my garden when I smelled bread baking, and I couldn't for the life of me figure out where it was coming from." She was a small, neat woman in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and dirt under her fingernails that spoke of serious gardening. Her eyes, bright with curiosity, took in the boat's transformed interior, the gleaming oven, the record player spinning Duke Ellington, the careful arrangement of tools and supplies that spoke of purposeful work. "This is remarkable," she said, accepting Cora's offer of coffee and a slice of still warm bread. "When I saw you working out here, I thought perhaps you were cleaning it up to sell. I never imagined ... She gestured at the cozy interior. The way afternoon light filtered through clean windows to create a space that felt both nautical and domestic. "I never imagined it either," Cora admitted. "It's been full of surprises." Mrs. Chun, call me Lucy, please, had moved to the area 5 years ago after her husband's death, trading a cramped apartment in Seattle for 20 acres of rural peace. Like Cora, she was learning to navigate widowhood and the strange freedom that came with answering only to herself. "I grow enough vegetables to feed half the county," Lucy said, savoring a bite of bread that was perfectly crisp on the outside and tender within. "But I haven't baked bread in years." There seemed no point, just cooking for one. "There's always a point to bread," Cora said, remembering her grandmother's voice echoing the same sentiment. Bread is hope made edible. By sunset, Lucy had shared stories of her extensive garden, her struggles with raccoons who considered her tomatoes their personal salad bar, and her ongoing battle with a woodchuck who had taken up residence under her porch. In return, Cora found herself talking about Harold, about the dreams they'd deferred and the unexpected peace she was finding in bringing those dreams to life in her own way. Danny had stayed for dinner fresh. Bread with butter Lucy had churned herself. Coffee that tasted better somehow when shared in the boat's golden interior. And conversation that meandered through topics both profound and comfortably mundane. As the 3 of them sat around the small folding table Cora had installed near the oven, watching the last light fade from the autumn sky. Something settled into place that had been missing from Cora's life since Harold's death. Not the specific companionship of marriage, but the broader sense of connection to community, of belonging to something larger than grief and solitude. "This feels like what Harold and I always talked about," Cora said, surprising herself by speaking the thought aloud. Not the boat, exactly, but the feeling. Like we were building something that would bring people together. "Seems to me you're doing exactly that," Danny said, raising his coffee cup in a small salute, one loaf of bread at a time. That night, Cora wrote in the margins of Harold's travel journal for the first time since buying the boat. Day 37. She wrote in her careful librarian script, "The boat smells like home now, and it's starting to feel like it might become something even better. A place where stories are shared and loneliness goes to die." Outside her kitchen window, she could see the distant glow of solar lights Danny had helped her install around the boat's perimeter. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new repairs, new discoveries about what was possible when you stopped asking permission and started building dreams. Tonight, she slept better than she had in months. November brought the kind of crisp mornings that made every breath visible and turned the last stubborn leaves into scattered gold coins across Mackenzie's field. Inside the boat, Cora worked with increasing confidence, her hands now calloused enough to handle tools without wincing, her understanding of the vessel's quirks and possibilities growing with each passing day. The memory quilt had started almost by accident. While sorting through Harold's clothes, a task she'd finally felt strong enough to tackle, she'd found herself unable to simply donate everything to charity. His favorite flannel shirt, soft from decades of Saturday morning wear, the wool sweater she'd knitted him for their 20th anniversary, the work pants that still smelled faintly of the aftershave he'd worn every day for 40 years. Instead of boxing them for donation, she'd begun cutting the fabrics into careful squares, each piece carrying the weight of specific memories. The blue chambray from his Sunday shirt became a square that remembered church services and quiet conversations over coffee afterward. The red plaid flannel transformed into a piece that held the warmth of Christmas mornings and lazy weekend breakfasts. Now those squares were finding new life as cushion covers, wall hangings, and curtain panels throughout the boat's interior. Each piece was sewn by hand, a meditative process that let her fingers remember the texture of Harold's presence, while her mind focused on creating something beautiful from what remained. "That's his shirt, isn't it?" Danny had asked one afternoon, recognizing the distinctive blue fabric she was stitching into a seat cushion. "It seemed wrong to just give it away," Cora said, not looking up from her careful stitches. "This way, he's still part of what we're building." The boat was becoming something unprecedented in Cora's experience, a space that was entirely her own, but somehow belonged to everyone who entered it. The record player still provided the soundtrack for her workdays, but now the music was often accompanied by voices. Lucy stopped by most afternoons, usually bearing vegetables from her greenhouse or homemade preserves that she claimed were taking up too much room in her pantry. Danny's daily visits had evolved into genuine partnership, his engineering knowledge complementing a growing intuition about what the space needed. But it was the arrival of Oliver Whitfield that complicated everything in ways Cora hadn't anticipated. Oliver owned the antique store on Main Street, a cluttered cavern of forgotten treasures that Cora had browsed occasionally over the years without ever making significant purchases. He was Harold's age, had been Harold's age, with silver hair that he wore slightly longer than convention suggested, and eyes that held the particular warmth of someone who'd lived long enough to find humor in life's ironies. He'd appeared at the boat on a Thursday afternoon in mid-November, drawn by curiosity and carrying a thermos of what turned out to be excellent coffee. "Margaret Whitman tells me you're either having a breakdown or discovering your true calling," he'd said by way of introduction. "She's not sure which, but she's convinced it's one or the other." What do you think? Cora had asked, pausing in her work of installing Harold's quilt squares as window treatments. I think anyone who can make a rusty boat feel this welcoming probably knows exactly what she's doing, Oliver replied, settling into the chair Danny had built from salvaged deck. Planking. Oliver's visits became as regular as Danny's and Lucy's, but they carried a different energy. Where Danny brought practical knowledge and Lucy offered maternal warmth, Oliver contributed something Cora wasn't quite ready to name. Their conversations ranged from books they'd both loved to places they dreamed of traveling. From the challenges of reinventing yourself in your 60s to the particular loneliness that came with outliving your life partner. Helen died 3 years ago. He'd told her one afternoon as they worked together to hang a quilt panel that would serve as a room divider. 42 years of marriage. And then suddenly I'm learning to cook for one and sleep alone and make decisions without checking with anyone first. Does it get easier? Cora asked, holding her end of the fabric steady while Oliver marked the mounting points. Different, he said after a moment's consideration. Not easier, exactly, but different. You learn to carry the love differently, I think. Instead of something you're actively sharing, it becomes something you're honoring. The conversation had stayed with Cora long after Oliver left, echoing in her mind as she continued her evening work by the warm glow of the solar lanterns Danny had helped her install. The idea of honoring love rather than simply mourning its absence felt like a key turning in a lock she hadn't even realized was closed. But Margaret Whitman's concerns were becoming harder to ignore. The neighborly visits had evolved into something approaching an intervention campaign, with Margaret dropping by the boat at least twice a week to express increasingly specific worries about Cora's choices. It's not natural, Margaret announced. During one particularly pointed visit, her disapproval radiating from every carefully styled hair. A woman your age, spending all this time with strange men in an isolated location. People are starting to talk. What people? Cora asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. Well, everyone, really. Betty Henderson saw Oliver's truck here 3 evenings last week. And that young man Danny, he's here constantly. It's not proper, Cora. It doesn't look right. The accusation hit Cora like a physical blow. Not because it was true, but because it was so fundamentally wrong about everything she was building here. The boat wasn't a romantic rendezvous point or a scandal in the making. It was a sanctuary, a place where stories were shared and loneliness was transformed into connection. I'm making friends, Margaret, Cora said, her voice steady despite the anger building in her chest. I'm building something meaningful from something that was broken. If that looks improper to you, perhaps the problem isn't with what I'm doing. After, Margaret left muttering about phases and inappropriate behavior. Cora found herself questioning not her choices, but the community she'd lived in for 40 years. Had she always been surrounded by such narrow thinking, such quick judgment? Or had Harold's presence somehow shielded her from the harsh edges of small-town gossip? That evening, as she stitched another of Harold's quilt squares by lamplight, she discovered a note tucked into the pocket of his old work shirt. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible in Harold's careful handwriting. For Cora, it read, when you're ready to stop worrying about what other people think and start living the life we always talked about, you're braver than you know, and I'll be cheering you on from wherever I end up. She pressed the note against her heart, feeling Harold's faith in her settling into her bones like warmth from the wood stove. Tomorrow, she decided she'd ask Oliver if he'd like to help her plan the boat's electrical system. Danny had been hinting that proper lighting would transform the space completely, and Oliver's experience running a business suggested he might understand the practical requirements. Let Margaret talk. Let the whole town gossip if they wanted to. Cora was building something that mattered, and she wasn't going to let other people's limited vision dim the light she was creating from the ruins of her old life. Asterisk. The lanterns arrived in December, just as the first serious snow began to dust the mountains surrounding Millbrook. Cora had ordered them from an online supplier that specialized in marine lighting, choosing vintage-style fixtures that would complement the boat's classic lines while providing the warm, welcoming glow she envisioned for the long winter evenings. Ahead, Danny and Oliver worked together to install the electrical system, their partnership an unexpected source of pleasure for Cora. The two men were separated by more than 30 years in age, but they shared the particular camaraderie of people who understood tools and took satisfaction in work done well. Danny brought youthful energy and modern electrical knowledge. Oliver contributed the patient wisdom of someone who'd spent decades making old things work properly again. "Your grandfather would have liked this setup," Oliver told Danny as they ran conduit along the boat's interior walls. Clean installation, proper safety measures, and enough circuits to handle expansion. "He would have liked the whole project," Danny replied, securing a junction box with careful precision. He always said the best boats were the ones that brought people together instead of taking them away from each other. The first evening they tested the complete lighting system, Cora stood on the small deck and watched her boat transform from a dark shape in the snowy field into something magical. Warm yellow light spilled from every window, the lanterns casting gentle pools of illumination that made the surrounding snow sparkle like scattered diamonds. The effect was so beautiful. It took her breath away. "It looks like a lighthouse," Lucy said, joining Cora outside to admire their handiwork. "Like a beacon calling people home." That image stuck with Cora as winter deepened and the evening gatherings at the boat became as regular as sunset. What had started as occasional visits from curious neighbors had evolved into something approaching a tradition. Monday evenings brought Lucy with her latest knitting project and stories from her decades as a nurse in Seattle. Wednesday nights usually found Danny reading aloud from whatever book had caught his attention, his voice carrying easily through the boat's intimate interior. Friday evenings belonged to Oliver, who had an endless supply of stories from his years, running the antique shop and an appreciation for jazz that matched Cora's own. But it was the Saturday night gatherings that surprised everyone, including Cora herself. Word had somehow spread through Millbrook that the widow in the boat served excellent coffee, played good music, and welcomed anyone who needed a warm place to sit for a while. By January, Saturday evenings regularly brought 6 or 8 visitors, their ages ranging from teenagers to grandparents. Their reasons for coming as varied as their backgrounds. There was teenage Emma Patterson, whose parents' divorce had left her feeling displaced in her own home. She rarely spoke during the gatherings, but she listened with the intense attention of someone hungry for examples of how adults might handle life's complications with grace rather than bitterness. Jim Crawford came most weeks, still wearing the shadows of a tour in Iraq that had ended 3 years ago. He and Danny had found each other through the particular recognition that existed between veterans, and their quiet conversations about readjustment and purpose had become a cornerstone of the Saturday gatherings. Mrs. Rodriguez, who spoke little English but understood the universal language of welcome, brought her granddaughter Sophia most weeks. Sophia served as translator when necessary, but more often than not, conversation flowed around language barriers through shared appreciation for Cora's bread, the boat's cozy atmosphere, and the sense that this was a place where stories mattered. More than social conventions, the boat had become something Cora had never intended, but somehow always needed: an informal community center. A place where Millbrook's various forms of loneliness could gather and transform into something warmer and more hopeful. But success, Cora was learning, had its own complications. The first challenge came from the county building inspector, officious man named Peterson, who arrived on a Thursday morning armed with a clipboard an attitude that suggested he'd already decided the outcome of his visit. "You can't operate a public gathering place without proper permits," he announced, surveying the boat's interior with obvious disapproval. "Commercial kitchen facilities, proper egress, handicap accessibility. This space doesn't meet code for public assembly." "I'm not operating anything," Cora replied, working to keep her voice level. "I'm inviting friends over for coffee." 8 to 10 people every Saturday night constitutes a public assembly under county regulations. You'll need to cease operations immediately or face fines starting at $500 per violation. The threat hung in the air long after Peterson left, his official paperwork promising follow-up inspections and escalating penalties. Cora sat in the boat's warm interior, surrounded by all the evidence of what she'd built: Harold's quilt squares, the bread oven that had become the heart of countless conversations, the lanterns that had transformed her project from personal healing into community beacon, and felt the weight of institutional opposition settling on her shoulders like a familiar burden. That evening's gathering was subdued, despite her efforts to maintain normal conversation. Word of Peterson's visit had spread with the efficiency that characterized all news in small towns, and everyone understood the implications, even if no one wanted to voice them directly. "There might be ways around this," Oliver said carefully, his antique dealer's experience with local regulations making him the closest thing to an expert in the group. "Permits can be obtained. Codes can be met. It's a matter of time and money and determination." "How much time and money?" Emma asked with the directness that only teenagers could manage. Oliver's hesitation was answer enough later, after everyone had gone home and Cora was cleaning coffee cups in the soft glow of her lanterns. She found herself thinking about the note Harold had left in his shirt pocket. "You're braver than you know," he'd written. But sitting alone in her beautiful boat, with the threat of legal action hanging over everything she'd built, Cora felt less brave than tired. She'd spent 8 months learning to live without Harold. 3 months transforming his dreamboat into something that brought healing to herself and others. And now she was being told that success itself was somehow against the rules. But as she turned off the lanterns one by one and locked the boat for the night, Cora felt something harder than anger settling in her chest. She'd buried her husband, learned to use power tools, and created a community space from rust and dreams. She wasn't about to let a bureaucrat with a clipboard undo all of that without a fight. Tomorrow, she decided she'd call a lawyer. Tonight, she'd plan her strategy and remember that Harold's faith in her courage hadn't been misplaced. The boat had taught her that broken things could be made beautiful again, and she was beginning to suspect the same might be true for broken regulations. Asterisk. The hidden compartment revealed itself by accident on a bitter February morning when Cora was installing additional insulation behind the boat's forward bulkhead. Her screwdriver slipped, gouging the wood deeper than intended, and suddenly a section of what she'd assumed was solid paneling shifted under pressure. Behind the loose panel lay a space barely large enough for a shoebox, lined with oiled cloth that had protected its contents from decades of moisture and neglect. Inside, Cora found a manila envelope sealed with wax and marked in Harold's unmistakable handwriting. "For my dearest Cora, when you're ready for adventures." Her hand shook as she opened the envelope, and for a moment the boat's interior seemed to tilt around her like a vessel riding unexpected swells. Inside were 23 letters, each one dated and sealed, spanning the 15 years between Harold's 50th birthday and his death. The return address on each envelope was their own 1247 Maple Street, but they'd never been mailed, never been delivered, never been read. The first letter was dated Harold's 50th birthday, written in the careful script she knew as well as her own breathing. "My dearest Cora," it began, "if you're reading this, it means you've found your way to our boat. Yes, our boat. Though I suspect by now you've figured out that I've been planning this longer than I ever let on. I bought this old vessel Years ago, not long after my heart attack scare made me realize how many of our some days might never come. Cora sank into Danny's handmade chair, the letter trembling in her grip. Harold had owned the boat for 3 years before his death. Had planned for her to find it, to restore it, to transform it into exactly what it had become. She read on her, vision blurring with tears that had nothing to do with the February wind rattling the windows. I know how you are about taking risks, my darling girl. You've spent our whole marriage being the sensible one, the careful one, the one who thinks through consequences while I dream impossible dreams. But I've watched you, Cora. I've seen how your eyes light up when we talk about adventures, how you linger over travel magazines, how you hum while you cook, as if you're imagining yourself in some cozy galley anchored in a quiet cove. The letter went on to explain Harold's secret purchases, not just the boat, but the land it sat on, bought quietly from Mackenzie with money Harold had saved from his insurance commissions over the years. He'd planned to surprise her for their 40th anniversary, to present her with the boat and the beginning of their long-delayed adventures. But if you're reading this without me, the letter continued, I want you to know that the adventures were never about the boat itself. They were about you finally giving yourself permission to be bold, to build something extraordinary, to stop apologizing for taking up space in the world. The boat is just wood and metal, Cora. You're the one who will make it magic. Cora read through the night, letter by letter, watching Harold's handwriting grow slightly shakier with age, but his faith in her remaining constant as sunrise. He documented his secret visits to the boat, his plans for restoration, his growing certainty that Cora would find her way to it when she was ready. In the letter dated just 6 months before his death, Harold had written about seeing her working in their garden, lost in thought as she tended to the tomatoes they'd grown every year since their marriage. You look so peaceful out there, he'd written, so completely yourself in a way that you rarely let yourself be in public. I realize that's what I want for you. My darling spaces where you can be completely yourself, where you don't have to defer to anyone else's ideas about what's appropriate or sensible or proper. The boat could be that space if you let it. The final letter, dated just 2 weeks before Harold's heart attack, contained blueprints, detailed drawings of how he'd envisioned the boat's restoration, complete with electrical schematics, plumbing, plans, and interior layout suggestions that matched almost exactly what Cora had intuited during her own renovation work. But it was the last paragraph that broke her heart completely open. I know you think I don't notice how you shrink yourself to fit other people's expectations, but I do notice, and it breaks my heart every time. You are magnificent, Cora Fields, and you deserve a life as magnificent as you are. If this old boat helps you remember that, then every penny I spent on it will have been the best investment of my life. Build something beautiful, my love. Build something that brings people together. Build something that makes you proud to say, I did this. Cora. Set in the warm glow of her lanterns until dawn, Harold's letters spread across her lap like a roadmap to understanding. Everything she'd built here, the community gatherings, the bread oven that drew people like a beacon, the transformation of rust into beauty. Harold had seen it all in his imagination years before his death. He'd known her better than she'd known herself, had planned for her future with the same careful attention he'd brought to their shared past. But the discovery brought complications along with revelation. The legal documents tucked behind the final letter showed that Harold had indeed purchased both boat and land, which meant the threatening visit from the building inspector took on an entirely different complexion. This wasn't Mackenzie's property, with Harold's widow playing at restoration. This was Cora's land, legally and completely, bought and paid for by a husband who'd believed she would someday find the courage to use it. The knowledge changed everything and nothing. The boat was still the same combination of rust and dreams it had always been. Her neighbor's skepticism remained unchanged. The county's bureaucratic obstacles were just as daunting as they'd been the day before. But Cora herself felt fundamentally altered by Harold's hidden faith in her future. For 8 months, she'd been building something she thought of as a memorial to their shared dreams. Now she understood it was something else entirely, a foundation for the life Harold had always known she was capable of living. When Danny arrived for his usual morning visit, he found Cora sitting among scattered letters, with an expression he'd never seen before, not just determined, but absolutely certain. "You look different," he said, settling into his usual chair with the easy familiarity of friendship. "Good different, but different. I found something," Cora said, gesturing at the letters. "Harold's been planning this restoration for years. The boat, the land, all of it, he bought it for me, for us, for exactly what we've built here." Danny whistled low, his engineer's mind immediately grasping the implications. "So the county can't shut you down for improper use of someone else's property. They can't shut me down at all if I handle this right." Cora gathered Harold's letters into a neat stack, her movements deliberate and calm. Harold included detailed plans for bringing everything up to code. Proper electrical, compliant kitchen facilities, accessible entrance ramps. He thought of everything. That's going to take serious money. He thought of that too. Cora held up a bank document that had been tucked behind the blueprints. "Apparently, I own a savings account I didn't know existed. Harold's been putting money aside for this project for 15 years. As the morning sun streamed through the boat's clean windows, illuminating the quilted walls and gleaming surfaces that had transformed ruin into sanctuary, Cora felt Harold's presence more strongly than she had since the day he died. Not the crushing weight of loss, but the warm certainty of love that transcended death itself. Harold had built her a launching pad disguised as a memorial. Now it was up to her to decide what kind of flight she was brave enough to take. The petition arrived at Cora's door on a March morning when the last snow was melting into rivulets that ran like silver threads through Mackenzie's field. Margaret Whitman stood on the front porch with a clipboard and the expression of someone conducting unpleasant but necessary business. "I'm sorry it's come to this, Cora," Margaret said, though her tone suggested she felt more vindicated than apologetic. "But the neighborhood association has real concerns about what you're doing out there." The document bore 17 signatures from residents of the surrounding area, each name a small betrayal that hit Cora like physical blows. The Hendersons from the hardware store, who'd sold her most of the tools she'd learned to use. The Johnsons, whose granddaughter Emma had found refuge in the boat's warm gatherings. Even Pastor Williams from the Methodist Church had signed, despite the fact that Cora had attended services there for 40 years. Concerns about what, exactly? Cora asked, though she was scanning the petition's formal language even as she spoke. Public nuisance, improper land use, potential liability issues, and negative impact on property values, Margaret recited with the efficiency of someone who'd memorized talking points. "The county building inspector says you're operating an illegal commercial establishment, and frankly, some people are worried about the kind of element you're attracting." The element in question was apparently the diverse group of neighbors who'd found community in the boat's weekly gatherings. Cora thought of teenage Emma, learning that adults could weather life's storms with grace. Of Jim Crawford, slowly healing from wounds that went deeper than anything visible. Of Mrs. Rodriguez and her granddaughter, Sophia, practicing English in an environment where mistakes were met with encouragement rather than judgment. "These people aren't elements," Cora said, her voice steady despite the fury building in her chest. "They're neighbors. They're community members looking for connection. They're disrupting the peace and quiet that the rest of us moved here to enjoy," Margaret replied. Cars parked along the road every weekend, noise carrying across the fields. Strangers wandering around at all hours. Cora looked at the petition again, noting which names were missing as much as which were present. Lucy Chun hadn't signed, nor had Oliver Whitfield. Danny's uncle, who lived on Miller Road, had refused to add his name. But 17 households had decided that what Cora was building posed a threat to their vision of rural tranquility. "What do you want me to do about it?" Cora asked. "Scale back the gatherings. Maybe limit it to just your close friends, people from the neighborhood who've been properly introduced. Make it less public, less welcoming, less transformative, less everything that had made the boat project meaningful in the first place." "I'll consider your concerns," Cora said, which was as close to a diplomatic response as she could manage while her hands were shaking with anger. After Margaret left, Cora drove out to the boat and sat among Harold's letters, rereading his words about not shrinking herself to fit other people's expectations. The petition felt like exactly the kind of social pressure he'd wanted her to resist, but the practical implications were serious. 17 signatures represented real political power in a community as small as Millbrook. If those neighbors decided to push the county for enforcement action, even Harold's careful legal preparations might not be enough to protect what she'd built. That evening's gathering was subdued, despite Cora's efforts to maintain normal conversation. Word of the petition had spread with the efficiency that characterized all controversial news in small towns, and the regular attendees understood that their sanctuary might be under threat. "There are ways to fight this," Oliver said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd navigated small-town politics for decades. "Legal ways, political ways, community organizing ways." "What kind of community organizing?" asked Jim Crawford, his military background making him naturally tactical in his thinking. "Counter-petition," Oliver replied without hesitation. "Show the county that the boat has more supporters than opponents. Document the positive impact it's having on people's lives. Make it clear that this isn't just about one woman's property rights, but about what kind of community Millbrook wants to be." The idea took shape over the following weeks with the organic efficiency of any project that matched people's skills to pressing needs. Danny used his engineering precision to map the surrounding neighborhoods, identifying households that hadn't been approached by Margaret's group. Lucy leveraged her 5 years of residence to introduce Cora to neighbors she'd never met. Oliver contributed his businessman's understanding of how to frame arguments in ways that appealed to practical concerns rather than just emotional ones. But it was Emma Patterson who suggested the most effective strategy. "Why don't you just show them?" she asked during a Saturday evening gathering in late March. "Instead of trying to explain what happens here, invite people to see for themselves." The open house was scheduled for the first Saturday in April, timed to coincide with the anniversary of Harold's death and the beginning of Cora's restoration work. They sent invitations to every household within a 5-mile radius, including those who'd signed the petition. The invitation was simple: "Come see what we've built together. Refreshments provided. Stories welcome." In the weeks leading up to the open house, the boat's regular community threw themselves into preparation with the focused energy of people defending something precious. Lucy organized a committee to coordinate food contributions. Danny and Oliver worked together to install temporary lighting that would showcase the boat's transformation even after sunset. Emma recruited her high school friends to help with setup and cleanup. Cora found herself caught between hope and terror as the date approached. The open house represented everything Harold had encouraged her to be: bold, welcoming, unafraid of other people's judgment. But it also felt like putting her heart on public display, inviting the entire community to judge not just her restoration work, but the life she built from the ashes of grief. 3 days before the event, she received an unexpected visitor. Pastor Williams stood at the boat's entrance on a Thursday afternoon, his expression uncertain but his presence deliberate. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "I signed that petition without understanding what I was signing against." Cora invited him in, offering coffee and a seat in the warm interior that had become her second home. Pastor Williams, call me David, please, was a man in his 50s who'd served the Methodist congregation for 8 years without ever really connecting with the community's rhythms and needs. Margaret painted a picture of disruption and inappropriate behavior, he explained, accepting a cup of coffee and looking around the boat's transformed interior with obvious amazement. But Emma Patterson cornered me after youth group last week and set me straight about what actually happens here. He'd come to ask if he could help with the open house, and more than that, to offer the church's fellowship hall as a backup location if weather threatened the outdoor components of the event. His support felt like a tide turning, a signal that the community's response might be more complicated than the petition had suggested. On Friday evening, Cora sat in the boat surrounded by the evidence of a year's worth of transformation. Fields. Quilt squares glowed in the lantern light, each piece carrying the weight of memory transformed into beauty. The bread oven radiated warmth that would welcome tomorrow's visitors. The record player stood ready to fill the space with the jazz melodies that had provided the soundtrack for countless conversations about healing and hope. Danny found her there as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reflected off the boat's clean windows. Nervous? He asked, settling into his usual chair. Terrified, Cora admitted. What if no one comes except the people who already love this place? What if everyone comes and they hate what they see? Then you'll know where you stand, Danny said with the practical wisdom that had made him such a steady presence over the past months. And you'll decide what to do next based on the truth instead of assumptions. Outside, the solar lights that marked the path to the boat began to glow in the gathering darkness, creating a constellation of welcome that could be seen from the road. Tomorrow would bring whatever tomorrow brought. Tonight, Cora sat in the space she'd built from rust and dreams and Harold's unwavering faith in her courage, and felt ready for whatever judgment the community might render. The boat had taught her that broken things could be made beautiful again. Tomorrow she'd discover whether the same might be true for divided communities. The morning of the open house dawned with the crystalline clarity that only April could deliver in Montana. The air sharp with possibility and the promise of spring's full arrival. Cora woke before sunrise, her stomach tight with anticipation, and found herself drawn to Harold's compass, the brass instrument she'd discovered in his desk drawer and mounted in the boat's center console as a reminder that even when you couldn't see your destination, you could still find your direction. By 7:30, cars were already pulling into the makeshift parking area Danny had created in Mackenzie's lower field. The early arrivals weren't the opponents Cora had feared, but supporters carrying covered dishes and folding tables, people whose lives had been touched by the boat's quiet magic and who wanted to ensure that magic was properly displayed. Lucy Chun arrived with a truck bed full of potted flowers from her greenhouse, determined to create a garden pathway that would guide visitors from the parking area to the boat's entrance. First impressions matter, she said, directing Danny and Oliver in the placement of colorful blooms that transformed the utilitarian walkway into something approaching art. Emma Patterson and 3 of her high school friends had arrived at dawn to string lights between the boat and several temporary canopies that would provide shade for the food tables. Their youthful energy was infectious, and Cora found herself smiling despite her nerves as she watched them work with the focused determination of people defending something they loved. You ready for this? Oliver asked, appearing at Cora's elbow, with a cup of coffee and the calm presence that had become as essential to her daily life as breathing. As ready as anyone can be for having their heart examined by committee, Cora replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. For what it's worth, I think Harold would be proud of what you've built here. I hope so. I really hope so. The first official. Visitors arrived at 10 o'clock sharp. Margaret Whitman, and 2 other petition signers, their expressions neutral but watchful as they took in the transformed field. Cora greeted them with the same warmth she'd offer anyone, determined not to let their opposition poison the atmosphere she'd worked so hard to create. "Welcome," she said, gesturing toward the boat's open door. "Please, look around. Ask questions. Try the bread. It's fresh from the oven." Margaret's companions, the Hendersons from the hardware store, seemed genuinely surprised by what they found inside the boat. Pete Henderson ran his hand along the perfectly fitted joints where Danny had installed new cabinetry, his craftsman's eye recognizing quality work when he saw it. "This is real craftsmanship," he murmured to his wife, loud. Enough for Cora to overhear. "Someone put serious thought into this restoration." "The young man who helps her used to work construction," Mrs. Henderson replied, her tone suggesting she'd been gathering intelligence. "Military training, apparently. Knows what he's doing." More visitors arrived in steady streams throughout the morning. Some came out of curiosity, drawn by the novelty of a boat in a field. Others arrived with obvious skepticism, prepared to document whatever violations or disturbances justified their opposition. But many came with the quiet purposefulness of people whose lives had been touched by the boat's community, and who wanted to bear witness to its value. Mrs. Rodriguez arrived with Sophia and what appeared to be half their extended family, bearing plates of homemade tamales that disappeared within minutes of being set on the food tables. Jim Crawford came with his parents, elderly people who seemed amazed to see their veteran son laughing and relaxed in ways they hadn't witnessed since his return from overseas. By noon, the gathering had taken on the atmosphere of a country fair crossed with a family reunion. Children who'd never seen the inside of a boat explored every corner with wide-eyed fascination. Teenagers clustered around Emma, drawn by her obvious pride in the project and her stories about Saturday evening gatherings that had become legendary among her classmates. But it was the arrival of County Commissioner Sarah Walsh that shifted the event's energy from celebration to something approaching a public hearing. Walsh was a woman in her 50s who'd built her political career on practical competence and careful attention to constituent concerns. Her presence suggested that the controversy around the boat had reached levels that required official attention. "Mrs. Fields," Walsh said, approaching Cora with the measured courtesy of someone conducting official business. "I understand there's been some community discussion about your project here." "There has," Cora replied, gesturing toward the boat's interior. "Would you like to see what we've accomplished?" Walsh's tour of the boat was thorough and professional. Her questions focused on safety compliance, structural integrity, and the practical details of how the space was actually used. She examined the electrical system Danny and Oliver had installed, tested the stability of the deck planking, and asked detailed questions about capacity limits and emergency egress procedures. "You've put considerable thought into this," Walsh said, as they emerged from the boat's interior. "The work appears to meet most safety standards, and the community response is certainly impressive." Around them, the open house continued with the easy rhythm of people enjoying themselves in beautiful weather. The opposition that had seemed so threatening in Margaret's petition was certainly present, but it was vastly outnumbered by neighbors who'd come to celebrate what Cora had built, and to ensure its preservation. The moment of truth came at 2:00, when Commissioner Walsh called for everyone's attention and suggested an informal community discussion about the boat's future. What had been a relaxed gathering suddenly took on the gravity of a town hall meeting, with supporters and opponents naturally clustering on opposite sides of the makeshift speaking area Danny had created using hay bales from Mackenzie's barn. Margaret Whitman spoke first, presenting the petition's concerns with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been preparing her arguments for weeks. Traffic congestion, noise complaints, liability concerns, and the precedent of allowing residential property to be used for quasi-commercial purposes Her points were logical and carefully reasoned, delivered without the personal animosity that had characterized her private conversations with Cora. "We're not opposed to Mrs. Fields enjoying her property," Margaret concluded, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "We're simply concerned about the impact of large, regular gatherings on a rural area that was never zoned for this kind of activity." The response came from unexpected quarters. Pastor Williams stood up from where he'd been sitting with his wife near the food tables, his clerical collar lending gravity to his words. "I signed that petition," he said, his voice carrying easily across the field. "I signed it because I was told this was about noise and disruption and inappropriate behavior. But I've spent this morning talking to people whose lives have been genuinely improved by what Mrs. Fields has created here. Emma Patterson credits this place with helping her through her parents' divorce. Jim Crawford's parents tell me their son is happier and healthier than he's been since returning from military service. Mrs. Rodriguez is learning English, an environment where she feels welcome and supported." He paused, looking around at the assembled crowd with the careful attention of someone choosing his words deliberately. Sometimes the letter of the law and the spirit of community pull in different directions. "I believe what we have here serves the spirit of community in ways that our strict adherence to zoning regulations never could." The applause that followed was warm but not overwhelming, the measured response of people who appreciated the sentiment but understood the complexity of the issues involved. Lucy Chun spoke next, her nurse's training giving her a natural authority when discussing the boat's impact on community health and well-being. "I've lived in cities where isolation and loneliness were epidemic," she said. "I moved here for peace and quiet. But I've learned that peace without connection isn't really peaceful at all. It's just empty. This boat creates connection. It creates the kind of community support that prevents depression, reduces anxiety, and gives people reasons to look forward to their weekends." Danny's contribution was brief but powerful. "I came back from overseas feeling pretty lost," he said, his military bearing making him seem older than his 30 years. "The VA has programs for veterans, and they help, but what really helped was finding a place where I could use my skills to build something meaningful, where I could be useful again. This boat gave me that." But it was Sofia Rodriguez, 12 years old and translating for her grandmother, who provided the day's most compelling testimony. "Abuela says the senora with the boat makes her feel like she belongs here," Sofia said, her young voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "She says in Mexico, she was somebody important, a teacher, a leader in her church. Here, she feels invisible sometimes because her English isn't perfect. But at the boat, people listen to her stories even when she has to tell them in Spanish. She says the boat is the first place in America where she feels like herself again." Mrs. Rodriguez stood beside her granddaughter, nodding emphatically and adding a stream of Spanish that Sofia translated in real time. "She says the bread reminds her of her own grandmother's kitchen, and the music reminds her of Sunday afternoons when her whole family would gather to share stories. She says Mrs. Fields has built something that makes strangers into family." Commissioner Walsh had been taking notes throughout the discussion, her expression thoughtful but unreadable. When the testimonials ended, she stood up and addressed the crowd with the measured authority of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions. "I've heard compelling arguments on both sides," she said. "Legitimate concerns about proper land use and zoning compliance, balanced against clear evidence of significant community benefit. Mrs. Fields, I understand you've recently discovered that you have legal ownership of this property." "That's correct," Cora replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "My late husband purchased the boat and land several years ago. I have all the documentation if you'd like to review it." "I would, yes. And I'd also like to schedule a formal inspection to determine what modifications would be needed to bring your gatherings into compliance with county regulations for public assembly." Walsh's tone was businesslike but not unfriendly. "It seems to me that there might be a path forward that addresses the legitimate concerns while preserving what you've built here." The crowd began to disperse with the satisfied murmur of people who'd witnessed democracy in action, messy and imperfect but ultimately functional. As cars pulled away and the temporary infrastructure of the open house was dismantled, Cora found herself standing in the boat's doorway with Harold's guestbook in her hands. Cora found herself standing in the boat's doorway with Harold's guestbook in her hands. A simple notebook where visitors had been invited to sign their names and share brief comments about their experience. Page after page bore witness to the boat's impact. Expressions of gratitude, stories of healing, commitments to continued support, and the names of people who'd found something precious in this unlikely sanctuary. Whatever bureaucratic challenges lay ahead, Cora knew she'd succeeded in building exactly what Harold had envisioned, a place where broken things could be made beautiful again, and where community could grow from the fertile soil of shared stories and mutual care. 1 year later, on a September morning that echoed the crisp clarity of the day Cora had first bought the boat. The launching ceremony drew visitors from 3 counties. The simple printed program in Cora's hands bore the heading, "The Harold Fields Community Maritime Center," a celebration of dreams made real, and below it, a photograph of the boat in its transformed glory, windows gleaming, deck planking golden in the autumn light, and Harold's compass mounted proudly in the center console like a beacon of direction found. The past 12 months had been a whirlwind of permits and inspections, fundraising and construction, political negotiations, and community organizing. Commissioner Walsh had kept her word about finding a path forward, but that path had required bringing the boat into full compliance with county regulations for public assembly spaces. Handicap-accessible ramps now provided entry from multiple directions. Professional-grade electrical systems powered not just Cora's original lanterns, but also emergency lighting and communication systems. The kitchen had been expanded and certified for food service, with commercial-grade appliances that complemented rather than replaced Harold's beloved bread oven. The modifications had cost nearly $40,000, money that had materialized through a combination of Harold's secret savings account, a county rural development grant that Pastor Williams had helped Cora navigate, and a grassroots fundraising campaign that had drawn support from as far away as Billings and Bozeman. Emma Patterson had organized a social media campaign that had caught the attention of a lifestyle blogger in Helena, whose story about the boat lady of Millbrook had generated donations from strangers who understood the value of spaces where community could flourish. But the most significant changes weren't architectural. They were human. Danny Reeves had completed his engineering degree and started his own contracting business, with the boat restoration serving as his portfolio piece and proof of concept. His first major contract was designing accessible housing for veterans in Great Falls, a project that had grown directly from his experience helping Cora create inclusive spaces. He still came to the boat every Saturday evening, but now he brought his girlfriend Sarah, a physical therapist who'd been drawn to Millbrook by stories of the community Danny had found there. Lucy Chun had become the boat's unofficial program coordinator, her nursing background making her a natural organizer for the health and wellness workshops that now complemented the original music and storytelling gatherings. The Tuesday afternoon gardening circles she'd started had evolved into a community-supported agriculture program that supplied fresh produce to 3 local food banks. Emma Patterson was a senior now, college-bound but committed to returning to D's Millbrook after graduation to start a nonprofit focused on rural community development. Her senior project had documented the boat's impact on mental health outcomes in the surrounding counties, research that had caught the attention of the state university's social work program and secured her a full scholarship. Mrs. Rodriguez had become the boat's Spanish-language storyteller, her Thursday evening sessions, drawing families from across the region who were hungry for cultural connection and bilingual community. Sophia, now 13 and fluent in the confidence that came from being genuinely valued, served as both translator and junior programmer, helping to organize events that bridged generational and linguistic divides. And Oliver, dear, patient Oliver, had asked Cora to marry him on a February evening when the boat was filled with the warm glow of lanterns and the sound of jazz filtering through snow-muffled windows. She'd said yes, not because she was ready to replace Harold's memory, but because she'd learned that love wasn't a finite resource that diminished when shared. Harold's love had launched her into this new life. Oliver's love would help her navigate the waters ahead. As the launching ceremony began, Cora stood on the boat's deck with the printed program in one hand and Harold's compass in the other. Not the mounted version that had become part of the boat's permanent fixtures, but the original brass instrument she'd carried with her throughout the restoration as a reminder that direction mattered more than destination. Commissioner Walsh offered brief remarks about the importance of public-private partnerships in rural community development. Pastor Williams led a non-denominational blessing that acknowledged the sacred nature of spaces where people gathered to share stories and support each other. Lucy Chun presented a proclamation from the governor recognizing the Harold Fields Community Maritime Center as a model for innovative rural programming. But it was Cora's own speech that brought tears to most eyes in the assembled crowd. Harold always said the best adventures were the ones that brought people together instead of taking them away from each other. She began, her voice carrying clearly across the field, where 200 people had gathered to celebrate what had grown from rust and dreams. I thought I was restoring this boat as a memorial to the adventures we never took. Instead, I discovered I was building a launching pad for adventures I never imagined were possible. She looked down at the faces in the crowd, some familiar, some strangers who'd driven hours to witness the ceremony, all of them connected by the understanding that community was something you built rather than something you simply found. This boat taught me that broken things can be made beautiful again, that isolation can be transformed into connection, and that it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be. But most importantly, it taught me that the best way to honor someone's memory isn't to preserve it unchanged, but to let it grow into something even more magnificent than they originally imagined. As the sun set behind the mountains that surrounded Millbrook, the boat's lanterns began to glow with the warm light that had guided so many visitors from darkness into community. The launching ceremony was complete, but the real adventure, the daily work of creating spaces where people could find connection, healing, and purpose would continue for years to come. Harold had been right about everything except the timeline. Their adventures hadn't ended with his death. They'd simply taken a different course, guided by a compass that pointed not toward distant horizons, but toward the infinite possibilities that existed wherever people gathered to share stories, break bread, and remind each other that none of us has to navigate life's waters alone.